Unfortunately, I think for largely domestic political reasons, the way American politics works, the United States has not been a particularly good ally to Israel. We've been incredibly supportive. We've given them pretty much whatever they wanted most of the time, regardless of how they have acted. But as a result, that's encouraged Israel to take steps or to do things that haven't made Israel more secure, and I would argue have actually made it less secure over time, and have also encouraged or tolerated some of the most extreme elements in Israeli society, the settler movement, the religious conservatives that are becoming, more numerous and more influential, and I believe are, creating at least a real possibility of Israel essentially becoming a pariah state.
Well, America says it's Israel's friend, so surely America will step back, take a detached view, and encourage Israel to do the right thing for Israel, right? I'm not entirely. That's a setup for you to talk about your 2007 book if you want, or say whatever you want. But it's no secret. You think America has kind of abdicated what would be the duty of a true friend to exert some tough love.
Yeah, no, I mean, we all know that our friends are not necessarily being good friends if they just tell us that they'll support us no matter what, and they never tell us when we're doing something wrong. I mean, one of the best things your best friends can do is tell you when you're in a hole and digging, and suggest that maybe you put down the shovel. All right, so we're not being a good friend as individuals. We're not being good friends to the people we care about if we don't tell them the truth when we think they're making a mistake. And unfortunately, I think for largely domestic political reasons, the way American politics works, the United States has not been a particularly good ally to Israel. We've been incredibly supportive. We've given them pretty much whatever they wanted most of the time, regardless of how they have acted. But as a result, that's encouraged Israel to take steps or to do things that haven't made Israel more secure, and I would argue have actually made it less secure over time, and have also encouraged or tolerated some of the most extreme elements in Israeli society, the settler movement, the religious conservatives that are becoming, more numerous and more influential, and I believe are, creating at least a real possibility of Israel essentially becoming a pariah state. As Israel's principal ally, for America to bankroll that and support it and not try to do more to arrest that development seems to me very short-sighted. But being short-sighted is something American politicians are often quite good at.
And it's interesting, come to think of it, how rarely I think American politicians kind of put it this way, say, take issue with our current policy toward Israel and say, I don't even think this is good for Israel, let alone America. I mean, actually, that's two things American politicians rarely say. I mean, let's take the Gaza situation right now. I think it's fair to say you think Israel's policy is not in America's interest and is not in Israel's interest. Certainly at this point, whatever you think about how much initial kind of reprisal after October, was it 7th, was justified or wise. And it seems to me like a pretty easy argument to make in both cases, but you never hear politicians put it that way. And I don't understand what would be so incendiary about putting it that way. I mean, right? I mean, if you're there are a lot of American politicians, I think, in the Democratic Party, who have grave doubts about the wisdom of what's going on in Gaza. And what they generally say is there's too much suffering on both sides. Well, that's not a very pointed, way to put it. And I don't quite understand why, if they perceive there to be great political risk in saying, look, this isn't good for us and it's not even good for Israel, like, why is that something more people can't say?
I think the people to ask are Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, two congressmen who were primaried out and faced millions of dollars of donations from AIPAC and AIPAC-related organizations going to their opponents. So I think that for most politicians, particularly politicians who really don't care one way or the other about the issue themselves, it's just not high on their agenda. For most politicians, the safe thing to do is to talk about the ironclad commitment, to say the United States stands in Israel's corner, and not allow even doubts to surface about that. Now, you have some exceptions in some circumstances. So, famously, a few months ago, Chuck Schumer, whose pro-Israel credentials are of long standing, one of the strongest supporters in the Senate for many, many, many years, does stand up in the Senate floor and gives a speech criticizing not so much Israeli conduct, but Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was very interesting. Right. If you go watch the speech or read it, he's expressing his support for Israel, but he's very critical of Netanyahu. So he wants to pin all the blame on just one person, right? And by doing that, of course, he's trying to suggest, I'm not real happy with this policy, but of course, I'm still a steadfast supporter. All right, please don't come after me. And of course, Schumer, of course, got severely criticized by the far right in Israel. Mm-hmm. For being essentially a traitor, for turning his back on it. So even Schumer faced some pushback under those circumstances. But I think for most American politicians, even to say what you were suggesting, that this policy isn't good for us and also not good for Israel, is a step they're unwilling to take, because they understand they're going to face a firestorm of criticism, and they could face suddenly organized groups trying to drive them out of office. Let me say one final thing, though, about this. What I find really puzzling is I've yet to see a clear articulation from the Biden administration about why they think their current policy is in America's interest. All right. So you get statements about they want to see a ceasefire, they want to bring peace, or whatever. But I've yet to see, Blinken get up in front of the cameras and say, here's why what we're doing is making Americans safer, is making Americans more prosperous, is making the United States more respected around the world. I'm sure he has a thought in his head, but it's interesting that the administration doesn't make its case on that basis, which seems to me kind of the obvious way you'd want to defend the policy, saying, let's explain to you why sending Israel $18 billion of military aid to sustain its war effort in Gaza. Let me explain to you why that's good for America. I couldn't make that argument myself. I like to think someone in the administration has an idea in their head, but it's striking that they haven't said that out loud that I've detected.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when I was asking why American politicians don't use the formulation I suggested, I mean, I don't know exactly what Cori Bush has said, but it seems to me that the relatively few politicians who are far enough left to go ahead and make big criticisms of Israel's policy tend to do it in kind of moral terms, or in terms of what Palestinians are legitimately entitled to. I don't hear so much them saying it's not in America's interest. And let's assume, I mean, leave that aside. What if they just focused on saying this is not in Israel's interest? You would think it would be hard for AIPAC to get too indignant about somebody saying, I have a difference of opinion about what's in Israel's interest. I mean, see, the vibe you get from a lot of critics is, look, I don't give a shit about Israel. This is A, wrong, or B, bad for America, or C, whatever. I just don't hear often the discussion of what's even in Israel's interest, which would seem to me, in some cases, a smart way to put it. If you really wanted to get some people to pay attention to you, but
you could try that. But this is not really about me. But I will mention that if people actually read the book we wrote back in 2007. And published it, it defends Israel's right to exist. It condemns anti-Semitism in quite explicit terms. It talks about how we support a two-state solution. We say explicitly in several places in the book that the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival is in jeopardy. And we say that what we really need is not to get rid of the Israel lobby. What you need is a different Israel lobby. You need organized groups in the United States who are pushing the United States to adopt smarter policies that would be in America's interest and very much in Israel's interest. We said all those things in our book, and it didn't prevent of course, a firestorm of criticisms and denunciations and smear tactics and whatever. And I think part of it is that the groups in like AIPAC and the more hardline members of the lobby, what they want is unconditional American support. They want the United States to back Israel pretty much no matter what it does. And they don't really want to have a wide-ranging discussion of it. They don't want to have a big debate on these issues. They don't want to have people questioning that support. And so, it doesn't matter how nuanced your argument is or whether you frame it in the way you're describing and the way we did in our book, you're going to get criticized anyway because they don't want that conversation to happen. Now, what's occurred, and this I think is a big problem for AIPAC over time, is that sort of reality has finally penetrated. There is a more open discussion of these issues, like the conversation we're having right now. There are lots of alternative media sources now where people can get information. People can see on their smartphones what's happening in Gaza. It's impossible to hide it entirely. And so, in a sense, it's much harder to shape what people know, what people think, than it was, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I think that's a real problem for groups that are trying to sustain the argument that this is both, the morally right thing to do, but also in America's interest and also in Israel's interest. It's a long-winded way of saying that I think that these groups are losing the rhetorical battle gradually, and that's ultimately forcing them to sort of rely on power politics more than the old arguments that used to, persuade people pretty readily 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, and we should say, I mean, that when you talk about the 2007 book, you're talking about your book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, the one you co-authored with John Mearsheimer. And I guess we should say quickly that when you use the term Israel lobby, you mean more than AIPAC, which is an official lobby. You mean think tanks, pro-Israel donors, Christian evangelicals who are pro-Israel, and various actors
Right.
who aren't necessarily always communicating with each other in strategy, but amount to a force, however amorphous, of some magnitude, I think.
Right. It's an interest group like lots of other interest groups that have many different parts. Those parts don't necessarily agree on every single issue, but they agree on enough things. In the case of the Israel lobby, it's basically the agreement that the United States should have a special relationship of unconditional support for Israel, and that should be maintained. That's what unites all of those groups, even if some of them, support a two-state solution and some of them are opposed, or some of them would have certain attitudes towards the Abraham Accords, and others might think they weren't such a great idea, whatever.
Right. And one example is the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, an issue on which I think there was not unanimity within the lobby, but AIPAC. When Donald Trump, I mean, first of all, Obama, at some political cost, pushed the nuclear deal through, defying certainly some parts of what you would call the Israel lobby. And then Trump wanted Netanyahu wanted him to get out of it. Trump got out of it. A large number of Israeli elites think what Trump did was a bad idea. A lot of the national security establishment of Israel. And yet AIPAC supported Trump, as you note. Now, is that because AIPAC, just because its official mission is to support whatever the Israeli government says is the policy and Netanyahu was prime minister and this is what he wanted? Or is it because AIPAC is just particularly hardcore?
I think it's a little bit of both. That, AIPAC for years has not wanted there to be a lot of daylight between the Israeli government and themselves. It's also worth remembering that the late Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister in the 1990s and eventually assassinated by an Israeli extremist, he didn't have much use for AIPAC. He actually thought AIPAC was a problem because he was trying to work out some kind of political settlement with the Palestinians and was facing pushback from AIPAC. That's one of these places, one of these moments when there was actually some daylight between AIPAC and the Israeli government. I think AIPAC is, pretty far right, along with groups like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which was very outspoken against the Iran nuclear deal. And it's, again, one of these cases where I think, although you're absolutely right, that key members of the Israeli national security elite understood that the nuclear deal, although not perfect, was very much in Israel's interest. The government, led by Netanyahu, was adamantly opposed. Netanyahu had long seen Iran as, the main bogeyman that they had to worry about. I think a good case can be made that he has wanted to get the United States into a more direct confrontation, including possibly a military confrontation with Iran for a long time. And again, this to me is an example of just sort of short-sighted strategic thinking on the Israeli part. It's understandable that Israel wants to preserve a nuclear monopoly in the Middle East as the only country there with nuclear weapons. But the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, was a step in the right direction, certainly delaying any possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon. And therefore, it was in Israel's interest, which I think the Obama administration understood, but some key groups, the most important groups in the lobby, didn't understand, and they were eventually able to convince Donald Trump to take a fateful step, which unfortunately has caused Iran to restart its nuclear program and get closer to having a bomb than ever before.